Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into the world of medieval weddings. Imagine a time when weddings were far less glamorous than the glossy, Pinterest-perfect affairs we know today. In fact, they were often more about practicality than romance. After all, most couples weren't exactly choosing their partners for love. If you were living in the Middle Ages, your wedding might feel more like a business transaction than a fairy tale, but with a few surprising traditions thrown in. Trust me, you probably wouldn't survive this. The cold, the heavy garments, and all the strange customs might leave you wishing for your soft, modern duvet instead of a medieval feast. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, comment below your location and the local time. It's always fun to hear where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your medieval wedding experience begins long before the big day, far earlier than you might imagine. In fact, one of the first things you'd encounter in this entire process is the medieval wedding invitation. But brace yourself. It's not the elaborate cards you might be picturing, with gold leaf and handwritten calligraphy. Oh no, most medieval weddings had invitations that were, well, let's just say minimalist. In fact, it was usually just a simple verbal invitation from the groom to the bride's family, or vice versa, with maybe a few extra formalities if you were from a wealthier, noble background. But for the most part, you didn't get a glossy invite that's carefully designed to match your wedding color scheme. And when I say verbal, I'm not talking about an email or a text message. Think more along the lines of someone showing up at your door and announcing, "Your daughter is going to marry my son. Let's plan the wedding." Ah, yes. The charm of the medieval world. No formal RSVPs, no reminders to set your calendar, just a lot of shouting in the streets. Historians still wonder if these informal invitations led to some of the surprises we read about in medieval wedding accounts, like surprise guests and the occasional awkward misunderstanding. One can only imagine. At this point, your medieval wedding experience is probably already sounding a bit chaotic. But here's the thing. This wasn't just a wedding to you. No, this was also a social event. The location of the wedding, now that's an interesting piece of the puzzle. While today most weddings are held at grand venues or churches with stained glass windows and vaulted ceilings, the medieval setting was, well, it varied. But one thing's for sure, you weren't necessarily holding your ceremony at a church. It might surprise you to know that medieval couples didn't always get married in a church right away, especially early on in the Middle Ages. Some couples would marry in a home or at a local parish, and the church's involvement in the process often depended on the region. In fact, in the earlier medieval period, you might even have been married by a local priest or, depending on your status, a noble family member who was authorized to perform ceremonies. Talk about a low-key affair, right? Still, over time, weddings did start to shift more towards church ceremonies. And by the 12th century, most couples were married in some form of religious service. The reason? Church laws that started requiring weddings to be solemnized by a priest in order to be considered valid. So, if you were to get married by a random family member at home, you might run into some issues down the road. Not to mention, the idea of eternal salvation after marriage was a big deal back then, so you'd want to get it right. Let's shift focus to the bride now. Forget about the ivory white gown with lace details and a long, flowing train. No, that wasn't really a thing. The tradition of wearing white to symbolize purity and the new beginning of marriage wouldn't catch on until Queen Victoria's wedding in the 19th century. For you, if you were getting married in medieval times, you would likely wear something practical and, at times, surprisingly colorful. Imagine a nice, heavy dress made of wool or linen. Nothing too flashy unless you were from the upper classes. The more practical your dress was, the better. No one wanted a bride fainting from the weight of her clothing on the big day, after all. But let's not forget the fun quirks of medieval bridal fashion. A common trend for brides, especially among the wealthy, was a headpiece which could range from a simple veil to a more elaborate headdress made of fabric, ribbons, and even precious metals. While it might seem a bit much by today's standards, for medieval brides, it was all about signaling their status and showing off the family's wealth. After all, a wedding wasn't just a union of two people, it was a union of two families, with the potential for increasing status, wealth, and land holdings. As for the groom, well, he didn't exactly stand out in the fashion department. He'd wear something practical too, a tunic or robe with perhaps a bit of fancy embroidery if he had money to spare. And no, he wouldn't be the one wearing the ring. And speaking of the groom, let's talk about your attendants for a moment. Because while today you'd have groomsmen, bridesmaids, and flower girls prancing down the aisle, medieval weddings didn't quite work that way. Groomsmen and bridesmaids existed, but their roles were far more functional than festive. Think more along the lines of someone assigned the task of keeping an eye on things, managing the various groups, and making sure that the day didn't descend into complete chaos. As for the flower girl, that wasn't really a thing until later centuries. Now, dim the lights a little more. Feel the weight of your heavy medieval gown. And let's take a deep breath before we continue the journey. Now that the invitations are out and the bride's dress has been picked, no, it's not a sparkling white gown. Let's talk about the big day itself. If you thought a medieval wedding was all grand feasts and ceremony, think again. The wedding procession to the church, or wherever the ceremony was held, was often a bit, well, let's say, unpredictable. Imagine you, the bride, and your attendants marching through cobblestone streets, all while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. The chaos of the procession is probably one of the most amusing parts of medieval weddings. It was common for everyone to be shouting, pushing, and hustling to get to the church or venue on time. There might even be a few too many well-wishers joining in, leading to an impromptu parade that extended far beyond your guest list. And here's the thing, this wasn't some elegant, graceful walk you might envision from a royal wedding. Oh no. The streets of medieval towns were filled with mud, animals, and the occasional clumsy bystander. So if you were in your finest wool gown, you were likely trying not to trip over the hem as you made your way through all that mess. If you were from the upper classes, though, you might have had a team of servants or helpers, which certainly made the procession a bit more manageable. But no matter your status, there was always a sense of organized chaos in the air. Now, this was also the point in the day when certain medieval customs really took hold. For instance, the act of giving away the bride, something we now associate with a father walking his daughter down the aisle, was actually a pretty formal process. Back in medieval times, this gesture was more about transferring ownership. In a sense, the bride was being given to the groom as part of the larger social contract. Romantic? Not so much. Practical? Absolutely. The giving away tradition also involved the family showing public approval of the union. And while it was somewhat ceremonial, it still managed to have an air of business transaction about it. When you finally arrived at the venue, whether it was a church or a local hall, things got a little less chaotic, though not necessarily more refined. The church service, while sacred, was relatively simple by modern standards. Depending on where and when your wedding took place, it might be a very basic affair, with little more than a priest, a few prayers, and some vows exchanged. The vows themselves, by the way, weren't as romantic as we think today. The priest would often just recite a basic formula, and you, yes, you, would have to repeat it. There weren't many personal touches. In fact, medieval couples didn't even say "I do" as we know it. Instead, the bride and groom would affirm their commitment with a simple "yes" or "I will," which wasn't exactly the stuff of movies. This was still a serious, legally binding act, though, as medieval weddings were also considered a public contract of sorts, not just a personal commitment. Here's the quirky part. One of the lesser-known elements of these ceremonies was the kissing ritual, which didn't quite go the way you'd expect. Unlike today's carefully staged kiss at the altar, medieval kisses were often not part of the ceremony at all. Some records even suggest that kissing might have been avoided due to its excessive passion in some regions. How amusing to think that in some places you'd have to wait until the reception, or, let's be honest, until after the whole thing was officially over, to plant that first kiss on your spouse. As for the entertainment, well, if you were lucky, you'd be treated to some music, but not the soft string quartets or jazz bands you might expect. Instead, you'd hear live medieval tunes played on instruments like lutes, flutes, and perhaps even a harp. There was no DJ to announce your entrance, no sparkling champagne to toast, just simple live music that would fill the space whether you liked it or not. But honestly, it wasn't too bad. After all, you were just married, and your guests were likely more focused on their plates than on the sound of medieval flutes. Once the feast was over, the festivities would usually continue into the evening. People would sing, dance, and celebrate. But let's face it, the long day was probably starting to take its toll. A medieval wedding was less about grand romantic moments and more about connecting communities, securing alliances, and of course feasting on whatever could be hunted, gathered, or harvested. But no matter how tired you were, the day wasn't complete without one more element: the gifts and dowries. As for the entertainment, well, if you were lucky, you'd be treated to some music, but not the soft string quartets or jazz bands you might expect. Instead, you'd hear live medieval tunes, played on instruments like lutes, flutes, and perhaps even a harp. There was no DJ to announce your entrance, no sparkling champagne to toast, just simple live music that would fill the space, whether you liked it or not. But honestly, it wasn't too bad. After all, you were just married, and your guests were likely more focused on their plates than on the sound of medieval flutes. Once the feast was over, the festivities would usually continue into the evening. People would sing, dance, and celebrate. But let's face it, the long day was probably starting to take its toll. A medieval wedding was less about grand romantic moments and more about connecting communities, securing alliances, and of course, feasting on whatever could be hunted, gathered, or harvested. But no matter how tired you were, the day wasn't complete without one more element: the gifts and dowries. As the evening light fades, the weight of the wedding day begins to settle in. The excitement of the ceremony and the feast might be starting to wear off, but there's still a rather important part of the whole medieval wedding package: the gifts. And by gifts, I don't mean the shiny pots and pans you might get at a modern wedding registry. No, the gifts in a medieval marriage were more about status and practicality. If you were lucky, there might be some silver or land involved. If you weren't so lucky, well, you might have ended up with a handful of livestock. Or, if you were really unfortunate, nothing at all. The dowry system is something that may seem strange by today's standards. But back then, it was a crucial part of the entire marriage contract. You see, the dowry was essentially a way to secure the future of the bride, providing financial stability in case the marriage ended or the husband passed away prematurely. But more than that, it was a way of transferring wealth, land, or property between families. So the dowry was often the deciding factor in many marriages. It wasn't just about the bride's family giving something away. It was about both families ensuring that they were getting a good deal out of the union. If you were from a noble family, the dowry would have been substantial. You'd likely be talking about land, livestock, or even money. A wealthy bride could bring an entire estate into the marriage, and this would be seen as a way of solidifying the couple's future prosperity. But if you were a peasant, well, a simple dowry might be nothing more than a few chickens or a bit of grain. The dowry's value could vary significantly, depending on your family's status. Still, one thing remained constant. The more valuable the dowry, the more serious the alliance. But let's not forget about the gifts that the bride and groom might receive from the wedding guests. Gifts weren't just about helping the newlyweds start their life together. They were also a way for the couple to demonstrate their wealth and ability to host. These presents could range from simple, handmade items, like a quilt or some woolen cloth, to something far more extravagant, like a finely crafted sword or a set of tools. The richer the family, the grander the gifts. But remember, these weren't just tokens of affection. No, these gifts had a deeper purpose, one that tied into the whole concept of status and social standing. And speaking of social standing, let's turn to the rather peculiar tradition of wedding games. It might sound like something you'd find at a modern-day bridal shower, but back in the Middle Ages, wedding games were often part of the festivities. These games were not only a way to entertain guests, but also to test the bride and groom's readiness for married life. One of the most common games involved guessing the groom's future role as the head of the household. This often included symbolic tests to see how well he could perform tasks like handling farm tools, managing finances, or even solving problems that would come up in everyday life. These weren't just for fun. They were seen as a form of training, a way to ensure that the groom was capable of taking on his responsibilities. As for the bride, her role in these games was somewhat more limited, though she might be asked to perform tasks related to domestic life, like weaving or preparing food. The idea was that these games would showcase the skills the couple would need to survive in the often harsh conditions of medieval life. But there was also a lighter side to the festivities. Think of these games as medieval icebreakers, perhaps the only time during the wedding when things weren't so formal and stuffy. Now, after the games and gift exchanges, it was time for the most intimate part of the day, the wedding night. Ah, yes, the wedding night. You might imagine this as a passionate, romantic affair, but in the medieval world it was actually filled with rules and traditions that could make even the most eager newlyweds nervous. For one thing, there was no honeymoon. The concept of the honeymoon didn't become popular until centuries later. Instead, the newlywed couple would spend their first night together in the marital bed. But it wasn't exactly the private romantic getaway we think of today. The night was often spent in the presence of family or attendants, who would make sure the marriage was consummated. This wasn't about passion, it was about proving that the marriage had been completed in a legal and social sense. The idea was that the union had to be physically consummated for the marriage to be valid. It wasn't just about love or desire, it was about making sure the union could produce heirs, and for many medieval families, securing a legitimate heir was the primary goal. So, as you settle into your medieval wedding night, keep in mind that there might have been little privacy. The night wasn't about intimacy in the modern sense, but rather a more clinical confirmation that the marriage had been sealed. In fact, if the marriage wasn't consummated right away, rumors could quickly spread that there was something wrong with the union. In some places, a witness would even be present to verify that everything went according to plan. Can you imagine? But it wasn't all about business and rules. After this slightly awkward moment of confirmation, the real celebration could begin. In some regions, newlyweds were expected to continue the festivities with a sort of wedding tour, where they visited their family and friends to show off their new marital status. In some parts of Europe, this included public celebrations, where the couple would be paraded through the streets, sometimes on horseback, while townspeople cheered. The whole thing had a carnival-like feel, almost as if the couple had just finished an epic quest together. Of course, this wouldn't have been as glamorous as modern parades, but there was certainly a celebratory air about it. For all the formality and legal requirements of the medieval wedding, this was one of the few moments where you could really bask in the joy of your new status. And yet, despite all these festive traditions, weddings were still serious business. They were about forming alliances, securing families' futures, and ensuring the continuation of important legacies. The romanticized version of weddings we see today wasn't always possible or necessary. Still, in the midst of the legal formalities and the heavy expectations, there was a tiny spark of joy and community, something that might have helped you and your new spouse survive the sometimes grueling journey of medieval marriage. For the lower classes, this meant rolling up your sleeves and getting to work. Medieval couples, especially those living in rural villages, didn't have the luxury of lounging around and enjoying a life of leisure. Your marriage was part of the greater network of survival, and it was something you took on together. As a newlywed, you might find yourself working alongside your spouse, harvesting crops, fixing fences, or overseeing livestock. Romance, in the modern sense, simply wasn't part of the daily agenda. The truth was, marriage in medieval times was about duty, partnership, and the shared labor required to make life work. If you were from a noble family, things were slightly different, although not by much. While you might have had servants to do the heavy lifting, you and your spouse still had responsibilities. Nobles didn't have to worry about manual labor, but there were feasts to host, political alliances to manage, and estates to run. The higher your status, the more complex your responsibilities became. In these households, the partnership was often built on the shared effort of managing everything from finances to power dynamics between different lands. However, it wasn't all business. There were still moments of shared decision-making and companionship, albeit amidst the ever-present pressure of maintaining your social standing. What's perhaps most interesting about this transition into married life in the medieval period is how roles were clearly defined. The husband, as the head of the household, had the final say in most matters, including decisions about finances, land, and even the daily tasks of the household. The wife, in contrast, had an equally important role, but it was often relegated to managing the home, raising children, and overseeing servants. While the husband might have had more public responsibilities, the wife often had a greater influence over domestic life. But don't be fooled, this wasn't some idyllic, harmonious domestic life. Oh no, marriage was still a balancing act of power, gender expectations, and survival. In some ways, the wife's role could be even more challenging than the husband's, depending on the time period and location. After all, the ability to successfully manage the household, keeping the family fed, clothed, and healthy, was no small feat. There were, however, certain moments in marriage that might have allowed you to catch your breath. For example, the medieval tradition of celebrating important feast days provided a break from the daily grind. These celebrations, though not often centered on the couple themselves, gave you a chance to take a step back and participate in communal feasts and festivals. This might have been one of the few times in your married life when you'd get to dress up again. Enjoy a meal that wasn't just bread and stew. Even during these brief moments of respite, the weight of marriage didn't go away. You and your spouse would likely be busy negotiating the intricacies of social obligations and managing the politics of your community. For those from noble families, this might have meant hosting important guests, dealing with the intricacies of land management, and ensuring that your marriage had the right political weight. Here's the kicker. Even after all the stress of running a household, managing your estate, and ensuring the success of your family line, marriage wasn't a forever guarantee. Divorce was rare, especially among the nobility, and could only happen under very specific circumstances, like infidelity or consanguinity, marrying a close relative by mistake. But let's be real, even for the wealthiest and most powerful, marriage was an unpredictable, often rocky road. The notion of staying together for better or for worse wasn't just a line from a wedding vow. It was a deeply ingrained reality. But of course, no matter how rocky the road was, there was always the glimmer of possibility in the form of children. For medieval couples, particularly those from noble families, children were the future, literally. Your marriage wasn't just about you and your spouse. It was about creating an heir to carry on the family name, the estate, and the business. If you had a son, you could breathe a little easier, knowing that your wealth and status would be passed down. If you had a daughter, well, you'd likely be thinking about arranging a marriage to another family to keep things in the family business. Children were essential to the whole idea of marriage, and they weren't just cherished for their cuteness, though I imagine they were still adorable. But the reality of having children in medieval times wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Infant mortality was incredibly high, and it wasn't uncommon for a couple to lose multiple children before reaching adulthood. That's the part of medieval marriage that's easy to forget. While there was plenty of love and partnership, there was also a lot of heartache and sorrow. The strength of a medieval marriage wasn't just tested by the work you did together, it was also tested by how you coped with loss. Still, despite these challenges, medieval marriages, however awkward, difficult, or exhausting, had moments of joy, humor, and celebration. And in the end, that's what kept couples going. The hope of better days ahead, the laughter at a shared joke, and the quiet understanding that whatever else came their way, they'd face it together. Now that you've settled into your new routine of medieval married life, with all the daily work, occasional feasts, and the relentless push of family expectations, let's take a step back and examine some of the quirky aspects of medieval weddings that didn't always get the attention they deserved. You're still living in a world where superstition, customs, and old traditions hold a lot of sway over everything, including your marriage. One of the most fascinating parts of medieval weddings, and the years that followed, was the array of superstitions that surrounded the event. Medieval people were incredibly superstitious, and they believed that weddings, being such a pivotal moment in one's life, were especially susceptible to omens and bad luck. Whether it was the day of the week, the weather, or the bride's attire, there was always something to keep in mind if you wanted to ensure a successful marriage. For example, it was considered very unlucky for the bride to marry on a Tuesday. Why? Historians still wonder if it was simply because of an old saying that Tuesday's child is full of grace, and somehow that didn't sit right with medieval people. It might seem silly, but many believed that the alignment of the stars and days of the week could have a profound impact on your marriage's success. So, if you were planning to get married on a Tuesday, be prepared for people to look at you with a mixture of concern and confusion. But that wasn't the only superstition that could affect your wedding. Some regions also thought it was bad luck for the bride to wear pearls on her wedding day. Pearls were considered symbols of tears in medieval times. Wearing pearls, therefore, was like tempting fate to bring sadness and sorrow into your marriage. The irony, of course, is that pearls were also prized as symbols of wealth and beauty. So it was a bit of a balancing act for brides trying to navigate the fine line between fashion and superstition. Let's not forget about the wedding ring, which has its own fascinating set of beliefs attached to it. While the tradition of exchanging rings was not as universally common as it is today, it was starting to make its way into wedding ceremonies. The symbolism of the ring, especially the circular shape, which represented eternity, was something medieval couples took quite seriously. But what's amusing is that, in some cases, the ring wasn't just a simple exchange of symbols of love and commitment. In fact, in many places, the ring served more as a sort of proof of the marriage. If the groom forgot to give the bride her ring, there was a real possibility that someone might question the validity of the marriage. Forgetting a ring might even lead to public embarrassment. Imagine a groom trying to explain that, oops, he just left it at home, or worse, that he wasn't sure where it went. While the superstitions about wedding rings and the days of the week might be light-hearted, there were other, more serious concerns too. A very important superstition had to do with the first night, or what is sometimes referred to as the wedding night consummation. As we discussed earlier, it was believed that the marriage could not be considered legally valid until the union was consummated, and this could sometimes be witnessed by a third party. Because, of course, why not add another layer of awkwardness to your intimate moment? But beyond the awkwardness, the pressure to consummate the marriage was immense. Some communities believed that if the marriage wasn't consummated within a certain amount of time, it could lead to bad luck. In fact, many medieval couples would spend the first few nights after the wedding in a somewhat awkward state of uncertainty, knowing that the pressure was on to fulfill the marriage's legal requirements. This wasn't a time for intimate romance, but rather a time for quiet, anxious performance. Now, let's take a moment to talk about something that's a little lighter. In the medieval period, there were also a number of fun and sometimes hilarious wedding traditions designed to give a bit of levity to the whole experience. While the ceremony and feasts were certainly important, there were also wedding games and customs that were meant to entertain guests and ensure good fortune for the newlyweds. One such tradition involved a game called the bride's garter toss. Now, we all know the modern equivalent, right? The groom removes the bride's garter and tosses it to the crowd. But back then, the game was slightly different. Instead of the groom performing the removal, guests might try to grab the garter themselves, often through a bit of a scramble. You could end up with a rather chaotic scene, as everyone tried to catch a glimpse of the bride's attire, and honestly, it didn't do much to keep things dignified. But of course, some of the most amusing wedding traditions involved food, and by food, I mean bizarre wedding cakes that weren't so much cakes as they were towers of bread and fruit. You might have thought you were in for a sugary, multi-layered confection, but instead you could have ended up with something that looked more like a practical loaf than anything else. Sometimes, the tradition involved stacking these loaves into a towering pyramid shape. The couple would then try to kiss over the stack without knocking it over. An early version of who can keep their balance. Not exactly the elegant wedding cake we're used to today, but definitely a bit of fun, if you could avoid the disaster of sending the bread tumbling to the ground. Speaking of food, some medieval weddings also featured strange and highly symbolic foods that were meant to ensure fertility, good luck, and happiness in the marriage. A common dish at these feasts was a meat pie filled with all sorts of unusual ingredients like peacock, swan, and even pigeon. That's right, at your medieval wedding, you might have been treated to a peacock pie, which, while extravagant, was also somewhat questionable in terms of flavor. A far cry from today's chocolate fondue fountains. And just when you thought it couldn't get any weirder, let's talk about the infamous mocking of the bride. This tradition, especially popular in parts of Europe, involved guests teasing the bride and groom in ways that were not always subtle. The idea was to test the couple's strength and resilience before they embarked on the serious work of married life. It was an odd mixture of fun and discomfort that sometimes bordered on embarrassing. But that was part of the medieval wedding experience. The more awkward and embarrassing, the better. But after all this, the games, the teasing, and the oddly symbolic food, things would settle down. The marriage, now sealed by vows, gifts, and a lot of strange customs, would move into a new phase, one of partnership, responsibility, and, occasionally, happiness. Now that the first flush of excitement and strangeness has settled, let's take a moment to talk about something that wasn't exactly front and center in your medieval wedding, but was still just as important: the family. After all, a medieval wedding wasn't just about you and your spouse. It was about your families, too. This union, for better or worse, was the product of alliances, power struggles, and in some cases, quite a bit of coercion. Family expectations played a huge role in medieval marriages, especially among the nobility, where politics often weighed more heavily than personal affection. Let's start with the groom's side. In many cases, the groom wasn't just marrying the bride, he was marrying her family too. You, as the bride, weren't just expected to perform domestic duties, you were a piece of property, being exchanged to strengthen your family's political or economic position. Your father or guardian would have been very interested in the terms of the dowry, the status of your future husband's family, and what sort of assets you brought to the table. Your wedding was essentially a business deal, and your family was counting on you to make a good match. But the groom's family wasn't always on the same page as the bride's family, especially if there was a disparity in wealth or status. While it was considered a win if your family was able to secure a marriage with a more powerful family, it could also be a bit of a power struggle. The groom's family, of course, wanted the best deal for their son, and that often meant putting pressure on you and your family to provide the most substantial dowry possible. The entire process could easily feel like a chess match, with every move calculated for the benefit of the family as a whole. Now, of course, for common folk, this dynamic wasn't as high stakes. In rural villages, marriage was still about securing alliances, but on a much smaller scale. It wasn't necessarily about merging estates or political power. It was about ensuring you had a partner to work with, raise children, and help you survive the unpredictable hardships of daily life. That said, family involvement still played a significant role, and you wouldn't have been able to make decisions without the input of your relatives. After all, who else would help with the farm work, care for children, and provide support when things got tough? This brings us to another facet of the marriage, the expectations surrounding children. Let's be real. A medieval marriage was often about continuing. But here's the catch. Medieval people didn't exactly have modern medicine on their side. The high rate of infant mortality meant that many couples would lose children before they reached adulthood. While this would have been incredibly heartbreaking, it was also a reality that most families had to accept. In fact, the idea of having a large family wasn't just for the benefit of having lots of little ones running around. It was about the survival of your family. After all, children didn't just carry on the family name. They also helped with the labor of maintaining your estate or farm. And speaking of children, the medieval period had some pretty interesting views on them. While today we tend to think of children as precious and innocent, medieval society often saw them as miniature adults who were expected to contribute to the household right away. If you were a parent in the Middle Ages, you weren't just concerned about nurturing your children, you were already thinking about how they would contribute to the family business. A young boy might be learning how to manage the farm or help with blacksmithing, while a girl would be trained in domestic tasks like cooking and weaving. It was a very practical, no-nonsense approach to parenting. If you were fortunate enough to have a son, then your family would probably breathe a sigh of relief. Sons were essential to the survival of the estate and the family name. But if you had a daughter, things might be a little trickier. Daughters, while still cherished, were generally seen as assets to be married off to another family. And this, of course, led to an entirely new round of negotiations, more alliances, more strategic decisions. It's safe to say that marriage wasn't just about love or companionship. It was a game of strategy, survival, and inheritance. But despite all the practicality and pressure surrounding children, there was a surprising amount of joy and affection between parents and their offspring. Medieval people, despite the hardships they faced, still found moments of joy in their children. A young child's laugh, the way they would tug at their mother's skirt or cling to their father's side, these small, tender moments were just as important as any political marriage or business deal. As we ease through this discussion about family and children, it's important to remember that medieval marriages, while often far removed from today's romantic ideals, were still places of real connection, affection, and shared purpose. Even though your marriage might have begun with a dowry and a strategic alliance, it often blossomed into something more, something that was grounded in the shared hardships and joys of everyday life. In a world, in the end, it was about partnership. Whether you were a noble woman marrying for land and power, or a peasant bride marrying for survival and support, you and your spouse were in this together. And that partnership, grounded in shared labor and mutual respect, was the cornerstone of medieval marriage. By now you're starting to feel the weight of medieval marriage, not just as a social contract, but as a dynamic partnership that required more than just vows and feasts. It's clear that marriage in the Middle Ages was a blend of duty, survival, and social expectations. But what if we shift our focus for a moment beyond the rituals, the superstitions, and the business-like nature of it all? What was life actually like for a newlywed in those early years of marriage? Well, it wasn't all doom and gloom, but it certainly wasn't all romance either. After the wedding day, after the feasts and games, the dust settled and you and your spouse began your life together. The question then becomes, how did you navigate this new phase of partnership? The answer is simple: work, and lots of it. The life of a medieval couple was one centered around productivity, survival, and ensuring that the marriage would last. And as we've mentioned, this wasn't just about raising children or managing a household. It was also about learning how to adapt to your partner's quirks and figuring out how best to collaborate. For the wealthy, the daily routine might have seemed easier, at least on the surface. While you wouldn't be waking up at dawn to milk cows or gather firewood, your day would still be filled with responsibilities. You might spend your time overseeing your estate, managing tenants, or, depending on the time period, attending to the political affairs that came with nobility. There would be dinners to host, guests to entertain, and plenty of decisions about how to maintain your status in the world. And of course, your marriage, with its own set of political ties, could often become a bit of a balancing act. Who to trust, who to ally with, who might be a potential threat to your power. But if you were from the lower classes, your day would be far more straightforward and physically demanding. You and your spouse would work side by side, tending to the fields, repairing your house, and of course, raising children. It was a far cry from the noble class, where comfort and luxury were the orders of the day. For you, the newlywed life would often start with a heavy workload, as you would have to make sure you were both pulling your weight in the home and on the land. And don't forget, marriage wasn't just about surviving the day-to-day tasks. It was also about learning how to cooperate with your spouse, something that might have been easier said than done. Early medieval marriages often involved living under the same roof as extended family members. This was especially true in the rural parts of Europe, where the family household might include parents, children, aunts, uncles, cousins, and sometimes even hired help. Living in such close quarters could lead to tension, and some historians suggest that couples often had to rely on each other for emotional support amidst the stress of. The question is, did medieval couples actually have romantic moments? Well, yes, surprisingly. While the pressure of daily life may have taken precedence, there were still moments that could bring a bit of joy. The medieval period wasn't all about labor and survival. There were festivals, religious holidays, and family gatherings that gave couples the chance to relax, have fun, and maybe even share a laugh or two. At these gatherings, you could expect music, dancing, and the chance to eat foods you didn't usually get to enjoy during your regular workdays. The idea of quality time might have been different back then, but moments like these allowed you to unwind together, share stories, and strengthen the bond with your partner. And speaking of those quality time moments, let's not forget the role of religion in the marriage. While today we might think of marriage as mostly a secular institution, in medieval times, religion was central to everything, including marriage. For many couples, the church wasn't just a venue for the ceremony. It was an ongoing presence in their lives. Marriage was seen as a sacred bond, and many couples spent their lives attending Mass together, praying, and participating in religious festivals. Religious devotion was often something couples shared, and it helped to build a sense of unity in the marriage. It was an anchor, providing a moral framework and guiding principles for the couple to follow. But what if you didn't feel particularly religious? Well, that's a tricky subject. Most medieval marriages were formed with the understanding that both parties would follow the faith. After all, the church had a strong influence on social and legal matters. Marrying outside the faith, or not adhering to its rules, could have been seen as a scandal. For the most part, the shared spiritual life was just one more thing that helped reinforce the structure of the medieval marriage. However, that didn't mean everything was always harmonious. Like any marriage, there were disagreements, frustrations, and challenges. The medieval period was fraught with political instability, famine, and disease, which meant that couples often had to navigate very difficult circumstances. Sometimes marriages were tested by these external pressures, and conflicts within the household could arise. But even in these moments of hardship, many couples found ways to pull together, sharing the burden of their troubles. Whether it was the passing of a loved one, a crop. In fact, some of the strongest medieval marriages were forged in the fires of adversity. A couple who could work together through the most difficult circumstances often came out stronger for it. These marriages were about mutual support and shared survival. If you didn't support each other, there was a very real risk that things would fall apart. Even the wealthiest noble marriages while based on power and land, had to endure a level of emotional and personal connection. And that connection wasn't just about love. It was about ensuring the family's survival and the strength of their joint future. Of course, the way we think about marriage today is far removed from the medieval mindset. Modern marriages tend to emphasize romantic love as a cornerstone. But for medieval people, love, while important, was often secondary to the practicalities of family, duty, and survival. Yet even within those constraints, many medieval couples found warmth, affection, and partnership. It was a different kind of love, one shaped by the circumstances of the time, but it was still real. So, as you reflect on your own medieval marriage, whether you are a noblewoman in a grand estate or a peasant living on a farm, it's clear that your life would have been shaped by these practicalities. Yet, even amidst the rules, the duties, and the political games, there was room for connection, laughter, and companionship. The partnership of marriage in any form was about navigating a complex world together, balancing both the harsh realities and the small joys. And that, in its own way, is what made medieval marriages endure through time. Now that we've explored the daily life and partnership that defined your medieval marriage, let's turn our attention to one of the more fascinating and at times bizarre aspects of medieval weddings: the role of the community. Because while marriage was undeniably about the bond between you and your spouse, it was also deeply embedded in the social fabric of the time. You were not only forging an alliance with your partner, but with an entire network of families, neighbors, and even strangers who might have played a role in your marriage. Picture this. After the ceremony, the newlyweds didn't just retreat to their private quarters. No, the celebration was far from over. The community was involved at every stage, whether they were witnessing the exchange of vows, attending the feast, or even participating in the rituals. And in some cases, they might have even played a role in the marriage's success or failure. In medieval society, weddings were community events, often seen as an extension of a family's status within the larger network of townspeople or nobles. This wasn't just a quiet ceremony in a church. It was an event that could affect an entire village. Guests would often include extended family, local leaders, neighbors, and on rare occasions traveling guests who were simply curious about the occasion. The marriage was considered a way for families to demonstrate their wealth and social standing, and the entire community often saw it as an opportunity for socialization, networking, and entertainment. Here's where it gets a bit amusing. When it came to these community weddings, it wasn't just the high-born folks who showed up. In fact, wedding celebrations could get quite lively and unruly. In many cases, particularly in rural areas, medieval weddings were boisterous affairs complete with loud singing, dancing, and sometimes uninvited guests who just came for the food and drink. Imagine you as the bride trying to keep your composure while some rowdy, tipsy farmer from the next village is entertaining everyone with wild stories. Your wedding day would certainly be a far cry from the intimate affairs we're used to today. But even if the noise and chaos got a little, but it wasn't all goodwill and support. There were also customs and practices that had the potential to make things uncomfortable for newlyweds. One such tradition was the mocking of the bride and groom. Something that might seem strange to us, but was actually quite common in medieval times. It wasn't unusual for guests to tease the bride and groom, particularly after the ceremony. In some areas, the newlyweds would be paraded around the village or town in a procession of sorts, where villagers might shout jokes, tease, and sometimes even playfully criticize the couple. This was considered part of the fun, but it could certainly leave the newlyweds blushing and a little embarrassed. It was all in good humor, but the light-hearted teasing could be a bit much for a couple just starting their life together. As part of the social dynamics, there was also a custom of spontaneous gifts from the guests. In addition to the formal dowries and wedding presents, guests were expected to offer gifts of their own. These could range from something as simple as a bottle of wine or homemade bread to more extravagant offerings like a fine piece of cloth or a tool for the couple's trade. The practice wasn't as formalized as today's wedding gift registries, but it was another way for the community to show their support for the newlyweds. After all, the wedding wasn't just a party, it was an investment in the couple's future. Speaking of community investments, there were also several traditions that involved the group effort to ensure that the couple had a prosperous start to their married life. If you were a newlywed living in a rural area, it wasn't unusual for the village to come together to help you establish your household. Neighbors might pitch in to help build a new house or make necessary repairs to the couple's dwelling. In some cases, this communal effort extended to farming or other practical endeavors. Your wedding, in essence, became a time for your neighbors to provide you with the resources you would need to get your life together, and they saw it as an important social responsibility. Let's not forget the darker side of community involvement. There were always those in any town or village who would gossip or speculate about the new couple, especially if the wedding wasn't deemed proper by certain standards. In medieval society, there were often strict expectations about who could marry whom and whether the union was socially acceptable. If, for example, a couple had been married without the proper dowry, or if there was a perceived mismatch in social standing, it would become fodder for local gossip. This kind of social pressure could make things difficult for a couple just starting out, but it also acted as a way for communities to enforce societal norms. Even the smallest mistake, whether it was the wrong kind of gift or a late arrival to the ceremony, could be whispered about for years. The tall tales surrounding weddings were a major part of the communal experience, and no couple, no matter how noble or humble, could escape it entirely. At the same time, weddings were also a time for the community to come together in celebration. When a new couple was married, the entire village often took part in the joy. People would dance, sing, and celebrate for hours sometimes even days. The sense of togetherness was powerful, and for some couples, this sense of community support was what made marriage bearable. After all, life in the medieval period was tough. Whether you were managing a noble estate or working the land in a village. So, knowing you had a group of people backing you up made all the difference. Despite the challenges, these communal aspects of the wedding provided a sense of warmth, of belonging. Marriage was not only about creating a partnership with one individual, it was about becoming part of something much larger, a family, a village, a society. Through the lens of the community, marriage became a shared responsibility and a shared joy. This gave couples a certain stability, a sense that they weren't facing the trials of life alone. And as you drift further into the medieval marriage experience, you realize that, for all its chaos and complexity, your new life is built on the foundation of cooperation. Whether you're partnering with your spouse, your family, or your entire village, your marriage is less about solitary romance and more about navigating the many layers of life together. As the community plays its part in your marriage, the dynamics of your new life together start to reveal themselves. You've got the rituals, the shared responsibilities, and the weight of societal expectations pressing down on you. But what about the quieter, perhaps more intimate aspects of the medieval marriage? It's time to take a closer look at how the couple navigates the early years, adjusting to this complex union that is grounded in both affection and practical necessity. We've already talked about the daily grind of survival, with shared labor and routines that have little time for romantic notions. Yet, even in the midst of these demanding responsibilities, there were moments when your relationship with your spouse could flourish. Think of those rare times when you would sneak away from the bustling life around you, perhaps after a long day of work or a festive village celebration, and spend a quiet evening with just each other. For a medieval couple, these stolen moments were probably far more meaningful than we give them credit for today. After all, in an era where private time was limited, simply sharing a few moments of peace could be incredibly powerful. But what kind of intimate connection was there between a medieval husband and wife? Really? As much as we might like to imagine the romanticized candlelit dinners of today's world, medieval marriages weren't necessarily built around frequent moments of quiet affection. Remember, marriage in the Middle Ages was as much about survival as it was about partnership. Yet, even so, there were tender moments, whether in the shared chores around the house, the quiet evenings after a long day, or perhaps the occasional handheld stroll through the fields. There was one part of medieval life that we often overlook today: the ability to find solace in simple, everyday acts. You and your spouse, for instance, might have spent hours together weaving cloth, baking bread, or simply sitting by the fire, taking a moment to relax. While these weren't the highly romantic activities we associate with modern-day love, they were moments of connection that, in their own way, brought you closer together. These acts may seem insignificant now, but for a medieval couple, they represented something much deeper: shared time, shared labor, and the understanding that life was best navigated together. But of course, life wasn't always about the peaceful moments. The harsh realities of medieval marriage were unavoidable. There were no high-tech conveniences to ease your burden. No washing machines, no central heating, no endless variety of food to keep you satisfied. If you were a peasant, you would likely live in a small one-room house with no real privacy. The constant work of maintaining the household, whether that involved working the land or running a business, left little time for personal space. Your relationship with your spouse wasn't defined by luxury, but by practical cooperation. Every day was a test of your ability to work together and stay connected in the face of adversity. At times, there would be moments of tension. The pressures of the medieval world could weigh heavily on a marriage. If things were tight financially, if crops failed, or if the weather turned against you, there was often very little to fall back on. And these stresses were compounded by the ever-present pressure to produce heirs. The expectation was clear, especially if you were of noble birth. Your marriage had to yield. Interestingly, historians still debate how much true affection was expressed in medieval marriages, especially when considering the power dynamics between husbands and wives. Historians still wonder if medieval women experienced genuine companionship with their husbands, or if the constant burden of work and child rearing left little room for personal fulfillment. Some argue that women in medieval marriages were primarily focused on, after navigating the daily routines, the community involvement, and the complex emotional landscape of medieval marriage, we now arrive at the part of the journey that many couples of the time dreaded, yet could not avoid: the inevitable passage of time. No matter how strong your partnership, how well you work together, or how much affection you manage to carve out amidst the chaos, life in medieval times came with a built-in sense of transience. And that transience was felt acutely in the form of the medieval marriage's ending, whether through death, separation, or simply the changing tides of society. Let's start with one of the most difficult, yet inevitable aspects of medieval marriage: death. In an era where the average life expectancy was considerably shorter than today's, death was a constant companion. For the wealthy, death could still come early, whether through war, illness, or complications from childbirth, but for the common folk, it was a grim reality. The lack of modern medicine and limited knowledge about hygiene meant that disease could spread quickly through villages, taking loved ones before their time. For a newlywed couple, the idea of losing your spouse early in the marriage was always a looming threat. As a medieval woman, the death of your husband could have dire consequences. As a widow, you would find yourself in a precarious position, often relying on your family or community for support. Depending on your status, being widowed could either bring relief or immense hardship. If you were part of the lower classes, being widowed meant more than just the loss of your partner. It could mean the loss of your livelihood. If your husband was a skilled tradesman or farmer, his death might leave you with the burden of supporting the family on your own. The death of a husband also meant the loss of the household's primary breadwinner. For some women, this could lead to remarriage quickly, not out of love, but out of necessity.
And yet, there was a certain amount of independence that came with widowhood in medieval society. For the nobility, being a widow meant that you could inherit your husband's lands and titles, though you were often expected to remarry in order to keep control of these assets. Widows sometimes held considerable power over their estates, and in some cases, a woman could even act as a regent for her children if her husband died young. It wasn't all despair for the widow. Some women used their new status as an opportunity to strengthen their position in society, using the wealth and property they inherited to secure alliances through their own marriage or through the marriage of their children. The loss of a wife, however, had its own set of challenges. For a medieval man, being widowed wasn't just about emotional grief. It was also about losing a key partner in the household. A wife's role wasn't limited to bearing children. She was an integral part of the daily functioning of the home. Without her, the household would need a new caretaker. For the wealthy, it meant managing a household and land. For common folk, it often meant trying to survive without the practical skills of a wife who was adept at keeping the family going. And while death was a constant presence, it wasn't the only way that a marriage could unravel. The medieval world also witnessed marriages breaking down through separation or annulment. But this wasn't as simple as walking away from a partner because things weren't working out. No, the medieval marriage had a social and legal weight, and ending it wasn't easy. Separation, while occasionally practiced, often carried heavy social stigma. Annulment, on the other hand, was more complicated. For the rich, the church was the place where marriage could be dissolved, but the grounds for annulment were stringent. It wasn't simply about unhappiness. It was about proving that the marriage was invalid to begin with, whether due to consanguinity, marrying a close relative, lack of consent, or, in some cases, the inability to consummate the marriage. If a marriage was annulled, the couple could go their separate ways, but often this process was highly public, and the reasons for the annulment were scrutinized. Divorce, as we know it today, was. But what about the happy marriages that lasted, despite the weight of medieval life? While death and separation certainly left their marks, there were many couples who stayed together and endured the hardships of the time. These couples were bound by their shared experiences and mutual dependency. Their partnership was formed not just in the excitement of the wedding, but in the labor of raising children, running a household, and surviving the often cruel twists of fate. And although romantic love wasn't always at the heart of the union, it wasn't entirely absent either. Over time, as medieval marriages evolved, many couples found companionship, respect, and yes, love in each other. The bond forged in those early years could deepen into something meaningful. The medieval period was, in many ways, a test of endurance. Your marriage was more than just a commitment to one person. It was a commitment to the partnership, the family, and the community. Whether through death, separation, or the unyielding march of time, the couples who lasted learned how to adapt, compromise, and, above all, work together. And even though the medieval marriage was framed by duty and survival, it could also offer moments of joy, affection, and shared accomplishment. As the years passed, the roles of husband and wife began to change, slowly but surely. Over the centuries, the influence of the church, the rise of courtly love, and the evolving norms of society began to shift the very nature of marriage. What was once a union of convenience and survival began to transform into something more personal, more emotional. But that journey from duty to romance would take time. So, as you settle into the idea of your medieval marriage coming to an end, whether through death, separation, or simple life changes, remember that it wasn't the end of your identity as a partner. No, your marriage was a journey, a long, sometimes difficult, but ultimately meaningful one. And even though medieval marriages were shaped by their times, they still left behind a legacy of connection, survival, and love.
As the years pass and life shifts around you, there's one key part of the medieval marriage experience that we haven't quite touched on yet. The legacy. Yes, your marriage, whether it lasted until old age or was tragically cut short, left behind a ripple that echoed through the generations. This ripple wasn't just about land, wealth, or titles, though those certainly played a role. It was about the children you and your spouse produced and raised, the family traditions you built, and the larger community you were a part of. In the Middle Ages, the success of your marriage and your family was measured not only by your own well-being, but by how well your children would carry on your legacy. Children were the ultimate markers of success in a medieval marriage. If you were a noble woman, your role as a mother was integral to maintaining the family's name and inheritance. Your children, especially sons, were expected to grow into strong, capable adults who could protect and expand the family's land, wealth, and influence. This responsibility was ingrained into the very fabric of your marriage. Your ability to produce heirs wasn't just a personal achievement, it was a societal one. If you failed to have children, or if your children didn't survive to adulthood, your marriage could be seen as a failure in the eyes of society. But if you succeeded, your family's name lived on, and the benefits of your marriage rippled through future generations. For common folk, children were just as crucial, though for different reasons. While there were no vast estates to pass on, children were still seen as vital to the continuation of the family's livelihood. They were the future workers of the land, helpers in the home, and caretakers for aging parents. As a medieval mother, your job was to raise children who could contribute to the family's survival and well-being. If your family line continued through your children, then your marriage had been a success. Even if wealth or status wasn't passed down in the same way it might have been for noble families, the strength of the family unit and the survival of the next generation was an equally important legacy. And yet, this legacy wasn't always guaranteed. Childbirth in medieval times was perilous for both mother and child. Infant mortality rates were high, and many mothers died in childbirth or from complications afterward. So, if you were lucky enough to see your children grow up, there was a unique sense of pride that came with that accomplishment. Raising children in the Middle Ages wasn't an easy task. Whether you were noble, your legacy also extended to your role in the community. You weren't just a partner to your spouse, you were an active member of a larger, interconnected social network.
In medieval society, marriages were the glue that held together not just families, but entire towns, villages, and even nations. Whether you were part of a noble alliance or a small farming community, your marriage played a role in maintaining the social order. The alliances formed through marriage were often just as important as any formal contract or legal document. These bonds helped ensure the stability of communities and families alike. Your marriage was more than just a personal commitment. It was a building block in the larger structure of medieval life. As time went on, however, the nature of marriage began to evolve. The shift away from purely practical unions to the concept of romantic love started to gain ground, particularly in the later Middle Ages. Literature, poetry, and even courtly traditions began to highlight the idea of marrying for affection and companionship. While marriage had always been a union of partnership and necessity, the idea of romantic love, still in its infancy, began to creep in. And while it didn't necessarily change the marriage dynamics of the time, it laid the foundation for the future of marriage. But even as romantic love became more celebrated in society, the legacies of medieval marriages remained rooted in the same principles. A successful marriage, regardless of the era, still relied on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the enduring commitment to each other. Even if your children didn't inherit land or titles, they inherited your values, your work ethic, and your approach to life. The lessons passed down from parent to child became a part of the family's legacy. Think for a moment about the stories your family would tell long after you and your spouse had passed on. What would be said about the strength of your partnership? Would your children recount tales of how hard you worked together to make ends meet? Or would they remember the quiet moments when the world slowed down and you simply enjoyed each other's company? While we may think of medieval marriages as defined by hardship and duty, they were also built on the quieter aspects of life, the small, seemingly insignificant moments that made everything else worthwhile. Even the challenges you faced, whether personal, financial, or societal, formed the foundation for future generations. Your marriage wasn't just about surviving those challenges, but about how you overcame them. And that triumph, even in its... The idea of legacy in a medieval marriage is about more than just inheritance. It's about the ripples that are sent out, from your family's work on the land to the way your children will raise their own families. Even in a world so harsh, so filled with uncertainty, a marriage's legacy wasn't just defined by wealth or land, but by the lasting impact it had on those who came after. It was about the lessons learned, the shared experiences, and the continuity of life and love passed down through the generations. And so, even if your marriage didn't look like the romantic tales we hear today, it was still a story worth telling. Your story, your legacy, was one built on the foundation of community, partnership, and survival. The legacy of medieval marriage wasn't defined by how much you had, but by what you gave. The love that started with shared tasks, economic necessity, and family obligations grew into something that transcended time, something that lived on in your children, your grandchildren, and beyond. As the decades pass and your family's legacy solidifies, your medieval marriage, like any story, moves toward its natural conclusion. The passage of time, like an invisible river, flows ever forward, and the inevitability of change becomes more apparent with each passing year. The high-energy, early years of marriage, filled with intense focus on family, survival, and work, begin to slow. In the quieter years, when the children are grown or the household settles into a routine, the shape of your relationship with your spouse begins to shift again. But unlike the bustling energy of the early days, the later years of marriage bring a kind of peace and contentment, something that might have been hard to imagine when you first walked down that chaotic, mud-filled aisle. In these later years, the intensity of life starts to fade. Your responsibilities have changed. Your children are now adults, starting their own families, and your time is no longer consumed by the daily grind of managing the household. There are no more pregnancies to worry about, no more cries of newborns or the constant rush of chores. The constant struggle to make ends meet, whether financially or emotionally, has somewhat diminished. Instead, you and your spouse find yourselves in a quieter, reflective space. Life, though never easy, has started to take on a rhythm, and you now have time to enjoy each other's company in a way you never did when you were younger. It's interesting to note how much of the medieval experience was about endurance. People didn't expect a life of luxury or leisure. If you made it through the early struggles, if you raised children and weathered the storms of life, you were doing well. The concept of growing old together might not have been expressed in the flowery language we use today, but it was still there, quietly woven into the fabric of marriage.